Hi, listeners. This is your host, Aruba Khan from When the Rivers Run Dry podcast. And today we are going to be diving into the very complex and somewhat contentious topic of water policy, particularly in regards to drought response and irrigation management. For the comparative analysis, we would discuss the Murray Darling Basin Plan from Australia and the drought policy in Alberta, Canada. We would discuss how different governance and policy styles used by different regions still have some gaps and problems. We will see how these policies, when imposed by hierarchical governance, can blow up in their faces through these clips of the protest from the locals of the Murray Darling Basin.
These farmers say the Murray Darling Basin plan would put their livelihoods up in smoke. They're fighting fire with fire.
Governments couldn't give a shit about what happens to us people here. And
basically, the plan is bullshit.
Who is going to feed our growing population?
It is safe to say that the Murray Darling Basin plan was not well received by the farmers. We will have Morgan in the podcast to discuss and give background about the Murray Darling Basin plan. Then Hilary will discuss about Alberta, Canada's drought plan, and Jessica will provide the analysis of these policies. Over to you, Morgan.
Thank you for having me on the show. This is my first time on a podcast. So it's really great to be here to talk about one of Australia's most complex and contested water systems, the Murray Darling Basin. I know you've heard of the basin before, but to give background to those listening at home, the basin stretches across southeastern Australia, covering parts of Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, and the Australian Capital Territory. It's enormous, about 1/7 of the entire continent, and home to more than 2.6 million people. The river provides clean drinking water to about 3 million people, and the basin supports around 40% of Australia's farms, which produces 24 billion in agricultural goods each year. This basin also includes 50 First Nation communities whose cultural, spiritual, and economic ties go back to the river for thousands of years. Oh, and the wetlands support 120 of species of water birds and 46 native fish species. If you look at a picture of the basin, you can see how different the uses are around it. Heavy in agriculture, but also huge environmental needs. In the early 2000s, the basin was in crisis. After more than a century of over-extraction and fragmented water management between states, many rivers were drying, wetlands were shrinking, and water quality was declining. The Millennium Drought, which stretched from the late 1990s to 2009, was the tipping point, exposing just how unstable things had become. In response, the federal government passed the Water Act 2007, creating Murray Darling Basin Authority, or the MDBA, like I like to call it. Its job was to manage the basin as a single connected system and to design a basin plan that balanced human water use with environmental needs. Sounds like a great idea. The first plan came out in 2010. To do that, well, the first draft of the plan. To do that, the MDBA relied on some of the most complex hydrological modeling ever undertaken in Australia. These models simulated how water moved through 77,000 kilometers of rivers, storages, and wetlands, testing hundreds of scenarios under drought and flood conditions. These models were formed a scientific backbone of the basin plan, estimating how much water could be returned to the ecosystem without collapsing regional economies. So it proposed that the plan would return 7,600 gigaliters of water to the environment each year. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 3 million Olympic-sized swimming pools of water, and about the same as the entire annual flow of the Murray River that reaches the sea in a dry year. That's huge. That's a lot of water. This goal was made to restore the wetlands, river flows, and ecosystems after decades of damage. But the number, all that water caused such an uproar, irrigators and regional communities saw it as a threat to local economies and livelihoods. Within weeks, farmers in Griffith, New South Wales, burned copies of the draft basin plan in protest. A moment that became a very powerful image across national media. I think we even have a clip of it. And while this eventually cause changed and the revised plan was finalized in 2012, the environmental flows were cut down to 2,750 gigaliters, which seemed a drastic change from what was proposed before. The controversy never really disappeared. Over the next decade, debates about fairness, science, and transparency continued. And in 2019, when footage of the Menindee fish kills spread online, the basin plan had become a national symbol of both environmental complexities and crisis and policy failure. This all just comes down to what we're talking about today on this podcast, which is drought policy and all the complexities that fall behind it. So thank you for letting me come on and talk.
Thanks, Morgan. I'm here today to talk about Alberta and their response plan to droughts. So quick background on Alberta. Droughts are not exactly uncommon. Some of you may be familiar with the Dust Bowl, which was a notable drought starting in 1929, which lasted about 7 years and took a very significant toll on the agriculture industry in Alberta. More recently, in 2024, there was a relatively significant drought. In response, in May of 2024, the government of Alberta actually rolled out their drought response plan, or DRP. It's been updated a few times since, but the goal of this plan is to manage water shortages in a more coordinated and fair way, protecting people, critical economic activities, and the environment. However, some saw the protection of the environment as a lower priority as outlined in this plan. But the plan uses a 5-stage system, as you can see on my screen, the lower graphic, from 0 to adequate water supply, all the way to 5 for catastrophic drought. As you can see in the upper figure as well, we also have a risk ranking tool, which informs the drought response structure. Here you can actually see some of the management actions that may be implemented as a part of a response activity. The plan tailors responses to individual river basins rather than applying to a single province. The plan prioritizes people, essential services, livestock, and the environment. It actually relies first on voluntary cooperation and sharing agreements, which are called memorandums of understandings. These are not binding and they do not override licenses. Decisions on the response plan are based on continuing monitoring of snowpack, rainfall, and river levels, and clear communication roles are set out by the government stakeholders. It also promotes long-term conservation and infrastructure planning to build resilience for the province. The plan was developed using a mix of scientific data, hydrological data modeling, and stakeholder input. The drought response plan was generally seen as a step forward in coordinating water use, but many support its focus on cooperation and basin-specific actions. However, critics have argued it relies too heavily on voluntary measures and it lacks strong enforcement or protection for the environment. However, overall, the public viewed it as progress, but not a complete solution. And that's all for me today. Thank you.
Thanks, Hillary. So when comparatively analyzing these policies, we see that each took very different approaches, but still encountered similar problems, such as stakeholder inclusivity, scientific objectivity, and short-term risk management, resulting in further ecosystem degradation. In the MDBP's approach, multiple stakeholders, including farmers, rural communities, and Aboriginal communities, voiced concerns that the plan ignored their needs and cultural perspectives as it was too rigid in its implementation. Though the plan scientifically covered environmental needs, it lacked local legitimacy and scientific transparency. In contrast, Alberta's DRP utilized local engagement and embraced watershed networks. However, it also lacked the inclusion of Indigenous and vulnerable populations. Despite having a large variety of policy instruments, including regulatory, economic, suasive, and management, many communities suffered from a lack of access to resources and information. Because of Alberta's first-in-time, first-in-rights licensing, water allocations are done on a voluntary basis, which has resulted in very little actual transfers. Essentially, stakeholders, such as large farmers and those with access to capital or close range to infrastructure, have more adaptive capacity and policy influence. Because of the lack of inclusive perspectives, each policy was unsuccessful at addressing environmental degradation in favor of addressing the economic needs of specific stakeholders. But in order to address ecological degradation, we must analyze the complexity around science involvement in the political realm. While the MDBP was heavily rooted in scientific modeling, the complexity of it was not well interpreted by local stakeholders and brought up questions of ethics in scientific analysis. In Alberta, the science surrounding climate change is heavily disputed and somewhat absent from decision-making. At the nexus of science and policy, it is often expected that science will produce one objective and predictive truth. But this is not really the case and is highlighted in the case of the MDBP, where different researchers questioned the subjectivity and administrative capture of science, essentially questioning the motives of science in decision-making processes. Gaps in scientific data is prevalent, and this highlights the necessity for inclusive and reflexive governance, as resilience is best achieved by filling in the data gaps using multiple knowledge streams. Each policy lacked thoroughly inclusive perspectives and thus suffered from legitimacy, whether formal or informal. This also applies to risk management, because both policies included short-term risk management but lack long-term strategies to address ecological resilience. Risk again falls into the theoretical realm of who exactly is defining the risk and what are the goals of risk management. In climate risk mitigation, the science is often too futuristic, disaster events are distant in time or geographical location, and political cycles frequently change. In both cases, we see long-term ecological restoration coming secondary to immediate economic needs, completely ignoring the connections between climate destruction, increased disasters such as drought, and the long-term economic effects. By analyzing the similar deficiencies in these very different policies, we advise applying a more adaptive governance framework. Adaptive governance, as opposed to adaptive management, allows for a hybrid construction of risk based on both reality and perception, rather than a system of managing natural resources using hypothesizing, testing, and implementation, and then synthesizing an objective truth rather than a subjective experience. Because of the reflective nature of adaptive governance, gaps in knowledge can be addressed by encouraging the connection between scientific and regional knowledge. This can be promoted through transparency and policy development in pursuit of achieving common goals. Utilizing policy instruments to encourage the equitable distribution of adaptive capacity, particularly within Indigenous and vulnerable communities, will strengthen regional resilience in ecological, financial, and social capacities. By incorporating different development styles and ecological protection strategies, cooperation and legitimacy between different stakeholders can be promoted. A very important element of successful adaptive governance is the inclusion of climate change science and environmental protection strategies. But environmental protection must be presented in such a way that addresses the concerns of stakeholders rather than highlighting competing values. Climate denial was an important driver in Alberta's decision-making. However, communities in the region can expect severe and prolonged droughts simply because it is a natural characteristic of the long-term variability of the region. In the MDBP, climate science was heavily promoted, but faltered at the alienation of economic actors. Deterioration of ecosystem services reduces producers' natural capital, and while environmental scientists often struggle to quantify the financial values of ecosystems, exploration and discussion of economic benefits of healthy ecosystems is possible and has the potential to bridge the gaps of opposing views. If economics is the language we must speak in order to encourage long-term ecological resilience strategies, then that's what must be done. Utilizing institutional knowledge and formalizing the space, this is for local watershed advisory boards, can help to diversify the education of best practices by accounting for regional, ecological, and social needs. Lastly, through adaptive governance, we propose more conflict resolution over water rights. Vertical and horizontal organization between government agencies and stakeholders must occur in order to meaningfully address conflict surrounding access to water that will inevitably occur with more frequency in the future. This positions risk management as addressing uncertainties and problems with resources as negotiated agreements between stakeholders rather than a win-lose situation. I think that's all the time we have for today, so I want to thank Aruba, the host, for having me, and Hillary and Morgan for their expertise.